here's something that might surprise you. The single most important thing you can do for your long-term health, the thing that research increasingly points to as the most powerful lever for longevity, metabolic health, cardiovascular function, and even cognitive performance, is something so simple, so low-tech, and so unsexy that most people completely ignore it. No supplements, no biohacks, no expensive equipment. It's just a very specific way of moving your body at a very specific intensity. And the frustrating irony is that most people who exercise regularly are actually doing it wrong. They're working too hard on their easy days and not hard enough on their hard days. And that middle ground, that gray zone where most recreational athletes and fitness enthusiasts spend the bulk of their time, is actually one of the least effective places to train. So today I want to talk about Zone 2 training, what it actually is, why it matters more than almost anything else in your exercise toolkit, how to do it correctly, and how to build it into your life as a beginner. Stick with me through this, because by the end you're going to have a completely different understanding of how the human body works and what it actually needs to thrive. Let's start at the beginning, because I think one of the reasons Zone 2 is so misunderstood is that people hear the word zone, and they immediately start thinking about heart rate charts and fitness apps with colorful little bands on them. And while heart rate is one of the tools we use, the concept of Zone 2 is really a metabolic concept, not just a cardiovascular one. So let me explain what's actually happening inside your body when you exercise at different intensities, because once you understand that, everything else makes sense. When you exercise, your muscles need fuel, and your body has multiple fuel systems it can draw from. At rest and at low intensities, your primary fuel source is fat. More specifically, your muscles are burning free fatty acids, which are released from your fat tissue, transported through the bloodstream, and then oxidized inside the mitochondria, the little energy factories inside each of your muscle cells, to produce ATP, which is the actual currency of energy in your body. Now, this is important. The key player here is the mitochondria. And the key process is called oxidative phosphorylation. It's aerobic metabolism. It requires oxygen, it requires functioning mitochondria, and it produces energy very efficiently. The byproduct is carbon dioxide and water, which you breathe and sweat out. Very clean, very efficient. Now, as you increase your intensity, as you start running harder, cycling faster, pushing more, your body starts to shift its fuel usage. Fat oxidation is a slower process. It takes more time and more steps to convert fat into usable energy. So when your muscles start demanding energy faster than fat can supply it, your body starts pulling in more carbohydrate. It starts burning glucose. And glucose can be metabolized both aerobically, through that same mitochondrial pathway, and anaerobically, meaning without oxygen through a faster but less efficient process called glycolysis. As you push harder and harder, the balance tips more and more toward anaerobic metabolism. Lactate starts to accumulate in the bloodstream, and eventually you hit what's known as the lactate threshold, the point at which lactate is building up faster than your body can clear it, and you're heading toward that burning, breathless, I need to stop feeling. Zone 2 sits just below that threshold. It's the highest intensity at which you can exercise while still predominantly relying on aerobic, fat-based metabolism. It's the sweet spot where your mitochondria are working hard but not overwhelmed, where your body is using fat as its primary fuel, where lactate is being produced but your body is still able to clear it as fast as it's being made. This is a metabolic steady state, and training in this zone consistently over time produces adaptations that are frankly remarkable. So what are those adaptations? Why does zone 2 matter so much? Let me walk you through the big ones, because I think when you hear these, you'll understand why I and many of the researchers and clinicians I respect most consider Zone 2 training to be the cornerstone of any serious longevity and performance protocol. The first and arguably most important adaptation is mitochondrial biogenesis. That is a fancy way of saying you grow more mitochondria. Your body literally creates new mitochondrial mass inside your muscle cells, and the existing mitochondria also become more efficient. Now, why does this matter so profoundly? Because mitochondrial function is one of the most tightly correlated markers of metabolic health we know of. Poor mitochondrial function is implicated in type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, neurodegenerative disease, and the general metabolic dysfunction that underlies so much of chronic disease. When your mitochondria are healthy and numerous and efficient, your cells can process fuel better. They produce less oxidative stress. They generate energy more cleanly. You are, in a very real sense, metabolically younger when your mitochondrial function is high. And the primary driver of mitochondrial biogenesis is sustained aerobic exercise at the right intensity. Zone 2. The second major adaptation is improved fat oxidation. The more you train in Zone 2, the better your body becomes at burning fat as a fuel. This sounds simple, but the implications are enormous. It means that for a given workload, you'll be burning more fat and less carbohydrate. It means your glycogen stores, the carbohydrates stored in your muscles, last longer, which is critical for athletic performance at any level. It means you're less dependent on external carbohydrate fueling during exercise. And metabolically, it means your body is getting better at doing exactly what it's supposed to do, mobilizing and oxidizing stored energy efficiently. For people managing weight, blood sugar, or insulin resistance, this adaptation alone is extraordinarily valuable. The third major adaptation is cardiovascular. Zone 2 training increases your stroke volume, the amount of blood your heart pumps with each beat. It increases the size and flexibility of your left ventricle. It improves your cardiac output. It reduces your resting heart rate over time. All of these changes mean that your heart becomes a more efficient pump. It can move more blood with less effort. And this translates directly into VO2 max, your maximal oxygen uptake, which is one of the single strongest predictors of all cause mortality we have in the literature. The data on this are extraordinarily compelling. Study after study shows that VO2 max has a roughly linear relationship with survival. The higher it is, the longer you tend to live. And Zone 2 training, done consistently over months and years, is one of the most reliable ways to build and maintain VO2 max, particularly when combined with some higher intensity interval work. The fourth adaptation is what happens with lactate metabolism. Your body becomes far more efficient at producing and clearing lactate. The cells that are best at using lactate as a fuel are the slow-twitch, type 1 muscle fibers, the exact fibers that are doing the majority of the work in Zone 2. And you also have specialized cells in the heart and the liver that are excellent lactate oxidizers. By training in Zone 2 consistently, you're essentially training your body's entire lactate shuttle system to work more effectively. This means that at any given intensity, you produce less lactate and you clear it faster, your lactate threshold rises, which means the intensity at which you start to tip into anaerobic metabolism gets higher and higher over time. You become, in simple terms, a significantly more efficient athlete. And then there are the downstream metabolic benefits that go beyond exercise itself. improved insulin sensitivity, better blood glucose regulation, reduced inflammation, improved lipid metabolism. Specifically, Zone 2 training has been associated with increased HDL cholesterol and reductions in triglycerides, which are two of the lipid markers most closely tied to cardiovascular risk. These aren't small effects. These are clinically meaningful changes that, accumulated over years of consistent training, represent a profound shift in your risk profile for most of the diseases that kill people prematurely in the developed world. Now, let me address something I said earlier, which is that most people who exercise are actually doing it wrong. Because I want to be specific about what I mean, because I don't want anyone to feel criticized. I just want to describe a very common and very understandable pattern that happens in the fitness world. It's sometimes called the polarization problem, or more informally, it's called gray zone training. Here's how it plays out. Someone starts exercising, they go out for a run, and because they're motivated, they push themselves. They go at a pace that feels like work, that feels productive. Their heart rate climbs into what would typically be classified as Zone 3 or Zone 4-4. Moderate to hard intensity. They're breathing heavily, they're sweating, they feel like they're doing something, and they're not wrong that this kind of training has benefits. But if the majority of someone's training volume is in that moderate, high-intensity range, they're missing out on the enormous volume of low-intensity aerobic work that builds the mitochondrial and cardiovascular foundation we just discussed. And they're also not going hard enough often enough to get the full benefits of high-intensity interval training. They're stuck in the middle, working hard enough to be fatigued, but not specifically hard enough to drive the most powerful adaptations. This is very, very common. The research on elite endurance athletes is instructive here. If you look at how the best endurance athletes in the world, marathon runners, cyclists, cross-country skiers, rowers, distribute their training intensity, you see a remarkably consistent pattern regardless of sport or nationality or era. Roughly 80% of their training volume is done at low intensity, what we would call Zone 1 and Zone 2, and roughly 20% is done at high intensity, Zone 4 and Zone 5. Very little time is spent in that middle zone. This is called polarized training, and it's well supported in the exercise science literature. The takeaway for beginners is this: if you want to train effectively, most of your training should feel almost embarrassingly easy, and a small fraction of it should feel very hard. The middle is, in most cases, the least productive place to be. So, how do you actually find Zone 2? How do you know if you're in it? This is where I want to spend some time, because I see a lot of confusion about this, and a lot of the guidance out there is either oversimplified or based on methods that aren't particularly accurate for most people. The gold standard for identifying your Zone 2 is a laboratory test, specifically what's called a lactate threshold test, where you exercise at progressively increasing intensities while a clinician takes small blood samples, usually from a finger prick or an earlobe, and measures your blood lactate concentration at each stage. Zone 2 is typically defined as the highest intensity at which lactate remains below roughly 2 millimoles per liter, give or take, depending on the individual. This is precise, it's personalized, and it's the method used by researchers and elite coaches. If you have access to this kind of testing through a sports medicine clinic, a performance lab, or a physician who does this kind of work, I would strongly encourage you to get it done at least once. It's enormously valuable to have actual data on where your zones are, but most people don't have access to that. And that's okay, because there are practical field methods that work reasonably well. Let me walk you through the main ones. The first is the talk test. And I know this sounds almost too simple, but there's real physiological reasoning behind it. Zone 2 is a metabolic steady state, and your respiratory drive at this intensity is such that you can still carry on a full conversation. You're breathing more than at rest, but you're not gasping. You're not having to pause mid-sentence to catch your breath. You can speak in complete sentences comfortably without straining. The moment you start finding it difficult to speak in full sentences, you've likely crossed above Zone 2. This is an imperfect measure, but it's surprisingly reliable as a practical guide, and it's something you can use in real time without any equipment. The second method is heart rate using what's called the Maffetone formula, developed by the coach Phil Maffetone. The formula is simple. 180 minus your age gives you an approximate upper heart rate limit for Zone 2 training. So if you're 40 years old, that would be 140 beats per minute as your ceiling. If you're 30, it's 150. And Maffetone adds some modifiers. If you have a history of illness or are just starting out, subtract another 5 to 10 beats. If you've been training consistently for 2 or more years without injury, you can add 5. This is a population-level heuristic. It won't be perfectly accurate for every individual. Some people will find their actual Zone 2 is higher or lower than this formula suggests, but it's a reasonable starting point, and it correlates reasonably well with the actual lactate threshold data in many studies. The third method is using a heart rate monitor combined with RPE, rate of perceived exertion, on a scale of 1 to 10. Zone 2 should feel like roughly a 3 to 4 out of 10. It feels sustainable. It feels almost easy. You could do it for a very long time if you had to. You're working, you're aware that you're exercising, but it does not feel hard. This is perhaps the most common mistake beginners make when they first try Zone 2. They feel like they're going too easy. They feel like they're not doing enough. The pace feels slow. The effort feels insufficient. And this is actually a sign they're doing it right, especially if they've been primarily training in that gray zone we discussed earlier. When you first start Zone 2 training after a period of mostly moderate, high-intensity work, you'll probably be genuinely surprised by how slow you have to go to stay in zone. That's not a failure. That's a starting point. And over months of consistent training, your pace at the same heart rate will improve dramatically. That improvement is the adaptation. That is the goal. Now let me talk about what modalities work best for Zone 2 training, because this is a practical question and it matters. The most important thing is that whatever you're doing allows you to sustain the effort for an extended period of time at a stable intensity without placing excessive stress on your joints or creating a level of cognitive engagement that makes the session feel like work on multiple levels simultaneously. The best options tend to be cycling, either outdoor or on a stationary bike, walking, particularly brisk walking or walking on an incline, easy jogging if your fitness supports it, rowing, swimming, elliptical, and hiking. Cycling is often considered the gold standard for Zone 2 because it's non-impact. It's easy to control the intensity precisely, and you can sustain it for long periods with relatively low injury risk. For people who are just starting, brisk walking, particularly uphill walking or treadmill incline walking, is often the most accessible entry point. And don't underestimate it. A brisk incline walk at the right intensity is completely legitimate Zone 2 training. So, how much Zone 2 training should you actually do? And how do you structure it as a beginner? This is where I want to be really practical, because there's no shortage of people who understand the theory but struggle to translate it into a sustainable routine. The minimum effective dose for zone 2, based on the research and based on what I've seen clinically, is somewhere in the range of 3 hours per week. That's not a casual suggestion. That's the approximate threshold at which you start to see meaningful mitochondrial adaptations accumulating over time. Now, 3 hours per week might sound like a lot, but I want to reframe it, because we're talking about low-intensity work. Work you can do while listening to a podcast or music or an audiobook. Work that, once you're adapted to it, doesn't leave you wrecked and needing recovery days. This is not the kind of training that requires you to lie on the couch for the rest of the day. It's fundamentally different in its recovery demand from high-intensity work. For a beginner, I would not start at 3 hours per week. That would be too aggressive an increase for someone who hasn't been doing regular aerobic exercise. Instead, I'd suggest starting with 3 to 4 sessions per week of 45 minutes each. That gives you roughly 2.5 to 3 hours per week, and it's a manageable structure that most people can realistically fit around their lives. As your fitness improves, and as the Zone 2 sessions feel progressively easier, you can extend the duration of individual sessions. Eventually, you might be doing sessions of 60, 75, or even 90 minutes. Elite endurance athletes doing serious Zone 2 blocks might accumulate 10 to 15 hours of Zone 2 per week, but that is not the target for general health, for longevity, for metabolic health. For the benefits we've discussed, 3 to 4 hours per week sustained consistently over years is extraordinarily powerful. I want to say something about consistency and time horizon, because I think it's absolutely essential to calibrate your expectations correctly when you're starting Zone 2 training. The adaptations we're talking about, mitochondrial biogenesis, improved fat oxidation, increased stroke volume, rising lactate threshold, these do not happen in 2 weeks. They don't happen in a month. The early improvements, the ones that start showing up in the first 4 to 8 weeks, are real but modest. The profound changes happen over 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, 5 years of consistent training. Zone 2 is a slow investment in a long, compounding return. And I think people underestimate this because we live in a culture that wants fast results and dramatic transformations. Zone 2 doesn't give you that narrative. It gives you something far more valuable, a gradual, durable, deep physiological remodeling that pays dividends for decades. There's a quote from the exercise scientist Inigo San Millan, who has done as much as anyone to bring Zone 2 into mainstream conversation, and who has worked extensively with professional cyclists and other elite athletes. He describes Zone 2 as the training zone where you're making deposits in the metabolic bank that you'll spend for the rest of your life. I think that framing is exactly right. Every session is a deposit. Every week of consistent training is a meaningful accumulation. The account compounds over time, and unlike financial investments, this one doesn't lose value in a market crash. The biology is remarkably consistent. Let me also address something that often comes up when people start doing Zone 2 training, and that is the question of heart rate drift. This is a phenomenon that's actually a useful diagnostic tool. What happens during a prolonged Zone 2 session, particularly if you're new to this kind of training, is that your heart rate will tend to drift upward over time, even if you're maintaining the same pace or wattage. You start the session at, say, 130 beats per minute. 45 minutes later, at the same speed, your heart rate is 140 or 145. This is called cardiac drift, and it happens because as you exercise, you lose fluid through sweat, your blood volume decreases slightly, and your heart has to beat faster to maintain the same cardiac output. It's also exacerbated by heat and humidity. For a well-trained athlete with good zone 2 fitness, this drift is minimal, maybe 5 beats over an hour. For a beginner, it can be more pronounced. The practical implication is that when you're doing zone 2, if you're using heart rate as your guide, you may need to reduce your pace or power output as the session progresses to keep your heart rate in the target zone. Don't fight the drift by pushing harder to maintain pace. Let the pace drop. The session is still productive. Now I want to spend a few minutes talking about how Zone 2 fits into a broader training framework, because I don't want you walking away thinking that Zone 2 is all you need to do. It's the foundation. It's the base. But a complete training program for health and longevity involves other elements too. Specifically, high-intensity interval training and strength training. And all three of these interact and complement each other in ways that are really important to understand. High-intensity interval training, what's often called HIIT, works at the other end of the intensity spectrum. We're talking about Zone 4 and Zone 5, where you're at or near your maximum aerobic capacity, your VO2 max. This kind of training drives different adaptations from Zone 2. It increases your VO2 max more rapidly. It improves neuromuscular function. It trains your body to tolerate and recover from high-intensity efforts. And critically, Zone 2 training actually makes your HIIT training more effective, because when your aerobic base is stronger, when your mitochondria are more numerous and more efficient, you recover faster between high-intensity intervals, and you can sustain higher quality efforts throughout the session. The two modalities are synergistic. For most people focused on health and longevity, I'd recommend something like 3 to 4 Zone 2 sessions per week and 1 to 2 HIIT sessions per week. The exact ratio depends on your goals, your current fitness, your recovery capacity, and your schedule. But don't neglect either end of the spectrum. Strength training is the third pillar, and it is non-negotiable from a longevity standpoint. The data on muscle mass and longevity are compelling. Sarcopenia, the loss of muscle mass and strength with age, is one of the most significant threats to functional independence and quality of life in older adults. Strength training preserves and builds muscle mass, improves bone density, maintains metabolic rate, and has significant cardiovascular and metabolic benefits in its own right. I'd recommend at minimum 2 strength sessions per week for anyone with a serious longevity orientation. And for most people, Zone 2 training and strength training can coexist very comfortably in a weekly schedule. They don't interfere with each other the way that very high volume endurance training might interfere with heavy strength training. Let me talk briefly about some of the common mistakes I see people make when they start Zone 2 training, because I think it's valuable to flag these in advance so you can avoid them. The first mistake, as I mentioned, is going too hard. You check your heart rate and you're at 155, 160, when your Zone 2 ceiling should be around 140. And because the effort feels manageable, because you're not gasping, you assume you're in Zone 2. But the heart rate tells a different story. Respect the ceiling. Slow down. Even if it feels embarrassingly slow, especially if it feels embarrassingly slow. The second mistake is inconsistency. Zone 2 training demands consistency above almost anything else. Doing 2 weeks of perfect Zone 2 training and then taking 3 weeks off because as life got busy gives you very little of the adaptation signal you're looking for. 3 sessions per week every week, month after month. That's the formula. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it has to be regular. The third mistake is using Zone 2 as a substitute for high-intensity work entirely. I've seen people become so passionate about Zone 2, which, again, is fantastic, that they stop doing anything intense. And while Zone 2 builds a tremendous aerobic base, you do need some high-intensity stimulus to maximally develop your VO2 max and certain other adaptations. Don't neglect the top end entirely. The fourth mistake is neglecting nutrition in the context of Zone 2 training. There's sometimes a misunderstanding where people think that because Zone 2 burns fat, they should train in a heavily fasted or carbohydrate depleted state to maximize fat burning. And while there's some nuance here and some strategic carbohydrate periodization can be useful in certain contexts, for most beginners the priority is just getting the sessions in and recovering well. Make sure you're adequately hydrated and that you have enough fuel to complete your sessions with quality. The fat burning adaptation comes from the training itself, not from aggressively restricting carbohydrates around sessions, particularly when you're just starting out. The fifth mistake is not tracking your progress. Because Zone 2 adaptation is slow, it can feel like nothing is happening, especially in the early months. But if you track your performance, your pace or power output at a given heart rate, you will see improvement over time. Maybe after 8 weeks, you're running at 6.5 miles per hour at the same heart rate that used to require you to go 5.8 miles per hour. That's a meaningful improvement. It reflects real physiological change. Track it. Celebrate it. It'll keep you motivated through the long months when the day-to-day changes feel invisible. I want to say something about why this matters beyond performance, beyond fitness, because I think the most important reason to build a consistent Zone 2 practice is not to run a faster 5K or to have a better VO2 max number. It's to preserve your health and function as you age. The statistics on physical decline as we age are stark. VO2 max declines roughly 10% per decade after age 30 in sedentary individuals. Muscle mass begins declining in the fourth decade of life. Metabolic function deteriorates, and the gap between the fit and the unfit widens dramatically with each passing decade. The good news, and this is genuinely good news, is that the rate of decline is far slower in people who exercise consistently. And much of that protective effect is attributable to exactly the kind of aerobic training we're discussing today. Think about what you want to be able to do at 70 or 80 or beyond. Do you want to walk upstairs without difficulty? Play with your grandchildren, travel, carry your groceries, hike? These capacities are not guaranteed. They are, to a meaningful degree, the result of decisions you make in your 40s and 50s and 60s about how much you move and how you train. The research is absolutely clear on this. The people who maintain high levels of aerobic fitness into old age are physiologically younger in almost every measurable way than their sedentary counterparts of the same chronological age. Zone 2 training, done consistently over years, is one of the most evidence-based investments you can make in your future self. I'll close with a practical framework for getting started, because I want this to be actionable. I don't just want this to be interesting information that you file away and never apply. Start by picking your modality: cycling, walking, jogging, rowing, whichever one you'll actually do and enjoy enough to do consistently. Then establish your Zone 2 range. If you can get a lactate test, get one. If not, use the Maffetone formula as a starting point, 180 minus your age. Subtract 5 to 10 beats to be conservative, especially if you're just starting out. Then go out and do 3 sessions per week of 45 minutes each, keeping your heart rate in that range the entire time. Use the talk test to cross-check. If you can't comfortably speak in full sentences, slow down. Do this for 8 weeks without worrying too much about pace or performance. Just accumulate the volume. In week 9, track your pace or power at your zone 2 heart rate and compare it to week 1. I expect you'll see a meaningful improvement. Continue for 6 months. Reassess at a HIIT session or 2 per week once the zone 2 is established and feeling comfortable. Integrate strength training if you haven't already. And then, importantly, don't stop. This is not a program with an end date. This is a practice. A long-term commitment to maintaining the physiological machinery that keeps you healthy, functional, and alive for as long as possible. The science on this is as clear as anything in medicine. Move. Move consistently. Move at the right intensity most of the time, and give your body the years it needs to make the adaptations that will define your health span. Zone 2 training is not glamorous. It doesn't look impressive on social media. You're not crushing yourself. You're not posting sweaty workout selfies with your heart rate at 185. You're going for a moderately paced bike ride or a brisk walk. But inside your body, inside your muscle cells, inside your mitochondria, something profound is happening. You are building the engine that will carry you through the rest of your life. And I think that is worth every minute. Thanks for watching. I'll put links to relevant research and resources in the description below. See you in the next one.